My name is Jim the Killer Miller, and with this in one hand and this in the other, I'm about to become the most prolific and paradoxical serial killer in the Wild West. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. As I'm sure by now you've surmised, I'm really not Jim the Killer Miller. Whether he was known as Killer Miller or Deacon Miller, he was always impeccably dressed. And that's going to become important later on. Always a stick pin in the lapel, bow tie, proper hat, and a long black frock coat, masking all kinds of viciousness and wizardry rarely seen before or since. Jim Miller's life began in 1861 around a little town called Van Buren, Arkansas. His father, a stonemason, moved the family to Texas where he got work building the first Capitol building in Austin. Shortly thereafter, his father passed away, and the family was taken in by Jim's grandparents on his mother's side. For reasons that remain unexplained to this day, at the age of 8 years old, Jim poisoned both of his grandparents to death with strychnine, or rat poisoning. For those of you that may not be aware, it's one of the worst and most painful ways a human can expire. For a brief, short period of time, it causes sensory heightenedness of sight and smell and sound, followed by the most extreme and violent muscle spasms known to break vertebrae in people's back. It's not knowable whether Jim watched or enjoyed the torturous last moments of his grandparents' life, but that event would leave him with one profound impression, which was he had nothing to fear from the law. He was deemed, because of his age, to be too young for arrest and too young for prosecution, and he was simply let go. The census of 1880 found him living with his sister Georgia and his brother-in-law, John Coop. One day in 1884, at the age of 23, following an argument with his brother-in-law, Jim would wait for him to fall asleep on the front porch and blast the life out of him with a shotgun by ambush. That was a common thread that will continue throughout his life. In this case, Jim was arrested for the first time, and he stood trial and was ultimately convicted, but shortly thereafter, the whole thing was thrown out on a technicality, and he simply walked away from the farm. Where he went is also interesting because he finds himself in McCulloch County, Texas, working for a man named Manning Clements, who's also an interesting figure in that he's the cousin of John Wesley Hardin. Manning Clements will have a daughter, Sally, that Jim would take a shine to, and they would ultimately marry in 1891. Like most outlaws at the time, banditry ran in families, and Manning Clements was no different. He will eventually be killed by the marshal named of Townsend. Jim Miller didn't think too much of that, and once again attempted to kill Marshal Townsend by shotgun. He lived, but he would lose his arm due to amputation. For the next few years, Jim and Sally would wander around the Texas-Mexico border and eventually settle in Posos County. Jim was hired briefly not only by the Posos County Sheriff's Department, but would ultimately be the city marshal in Pecos. While in Pecos, he worked for the sheriff named Bud Frazier. Bud Frazier was an interesting character in and of himself because he was actually also accused of several murders prior to becoming the sheriff, which back then wasn't really all that uncommon. If you wanted a sheriff that had the ability to deal with killers, you typically had to hire a killer. While on a trip to El Paso, Bud Frazier returned to Pecos, finding that Jim Miller had essentially turned Pecos City and County over to the bad guys and was himself involved in a lot of criminal organizations and the murder of a rancher. While the case was sort of sorting itself out in court, Bud Frazier, in April of 1894, encountered Jim Miller on the street. Being an experienced killer himself, he wasn't going to wait for Jim to get the drop on him, and the shooting began. Frazier hit Miller in the arm and the leg, and while laying on the ground, emptied his revolver into his chest, assuming that he was going to die. The problem was that black frock coat not only could hide a shotgun, but steel boilerplate that would ultimately save Jim Miller's life and throughout his life multiple times. After he recovered, he once again encountered Bud Frazier and a gunfight ensued where Miller was once again wounded, and once again, the boilerplate saved his life. At this point, Bud Frazier decides that he might as well get while the getting's good because he's not only lost his bid for re-election, he might soon lose his life at the hands of Jim Miller. Bud makes a mistake, though. He comes back from New Mexico where he had relocated, and Jim Miller finds out about it and takes a shotgun and blasts the back of his head open while he was in the saloon. Now, this is an interesting case because he's once again put on trial, and he uses the defense of, I didn't do any more to him than he had tried to do to me on multiple occasions, and believe it or not, he was acquitted of the crime. One interesting thing did happen, though, and that was one of the people that testified against him was a fellow named Joe Earp, who, yes, I'm sure you've probably concluded, is about to be killed by shotgun ambush. One of the ways that Miller beat the rap on that crime was he hopped on his horse and he rode 100 miles overnight to be seen in a distant town, thereby establishing a solid alibi. It's never been exactly proven that Jim Miller was in fact ever in the employ of the Texas Rangers. Some people theorize he was, and there are some loose connections to it, probably based on his experience with the brief periods of time he was a lawman, but that's really never been established from any sort of historical archive. The reason why I'm bringing that up is that's very common for people to be outlaws for a while, law enforcement for a while, as we discussed earlier. Around 1900, Jim and Sally settled in the Fort Worth area where she ran a boarding house. And Jim being Jim, he decided that he was going to advertise in the paper to be an assassin or killer for hire. Yes, in the paper. He even listed a dollar figure that he would actually work for. Now, if that's not clear proof that he has nothing to fear from the law, I don't know what is. One of the other interesting aspects about Jim is his understanding of the legal system at the time. One of the ways that you could expect to get away with being a for-hired killer and actually advertise it was actually kind of ingenious. What you would do is enlist a helper. In this case, it's going to be the name of Lawrence Angel, and you'll wait for your potential mark to be by themselves. Jim would just roll up on him with a shotgun, end his life, and then Lawrence would testify in court that the whole thing was done in self-defense. Kind of ingenious if you think about it. While Jim was marshal, he also had a penchant for murdering Mexicans that were always conveniently trying to escape. Shortly before his death, Miller bragged about killing up to 51 people, which I'm sure it's more. Maybe those are the ones he could remember, but it sure seems like in this case, that's probably not any sort of embellishment. While living in Fort Worth, Jim was known to be seen around town, always dressed to the nines and always toting a Bible. In fact, he became such a devout Methodist that people actually started calling him Deacon Miller. Miller never drank, he never smoked, and he never used foul language of any type. I think that's extremely interesting that this character is actually sort of hiding behind this facade of piety while he's capable of some of the most horrific crimes the Old West had ever seen. I find Jim Miller to be one of the more calculating individuals that the Old West ever produced. I'm sure he was highly intelligent, and I'm sure he knew by presence alone, you can almost still feel it from the old photographs, that he looked like an undertaker and definitely had the ability to put you straight in the ground. So where this all ends is in a little town called Ada, Oklahoma in 1909. His for-profit murder business saw him in the employ of some ranchers who wanted the property of a fella named Gus Bobbitt. Bobbitt was a former U.S. deputy marshal and a successful rancher and very well liked by the townspeople in Ada, Oklahoma. Miller gets hired to kill him, and him and some of his henchmen, they actually do. He flees to Texas. After a bit, he's apprehended by some Texas Rangers, and he's drugged back to Ada, Oklahoma. And he's charged with the murder of Mr. Bobbitt and awaiting trial. This is interesting because just prior to that, a fellow named Stevenson, in broad daylight, murdered the marshal of Ada, Oklahoma, and he beat the rap. He was actually found not guilty by a jury of his peers. And that's going to become significant because the townspeople had simply had enough. They knew that the evidence against Jim Miller was shaky at best, and they feared that another one of their outlaws would escape justice. April 19, 1909, 30 or 40 of the townspeople from Ada, Oklahoma, stormed the jail, subdued the deputies, and dragged Jim Miller and 3 of the men that hired him off to a barn. They're going to settle the matter out of court, so to speak, and lynch these 4 individuals. This is where things really get interesting for Miller, though. He only made 2 requests before they hanged him. One was he wanted his diamond ring to go to his wife, and the second thing he requested was to have his hat on while he was being hanged, which the lynchers agreed to. After his requests were met, Jim Miller actually stepped off of the gallows by himself, but not before yelling, "Let her rip." In a lot of ways, the life of Jim Miller ended as it should have, at the end of the rope. It's unfortunate that it didn't happen sooner, but perhaps if it had, the West would have been a little less wild. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and don't be afraid to like and subscribe.